Hello again, everybody, and everybody on Facebook that are joining us that we can't see at the moment. I'm sure there's some there. Okay, so today it's episode 3. It's the writing introductions. Generally speaking, introductions tend to be the first thing that you start writing, but also the last thing that you write. You always come back and you do generally substantial revisions to the introduction at the end. We do it at the beginning just to help us scope down what we're doing, help us generate ideas, that kind of thing. Let me share my screen before I forget. Okay, good. So writing an introduction, as Ajahn Pasapong just mentioned, we're all aware that we can have certain rhetorical moves that we can go through. And in my own experience, when you try to deviate from these, reviewers don't really like it. They expect to see things in certain positions in your paper, particularly editors. So they're looking out for these things in certain areas. And if they don't see them, they're very quick to point them out. So they might say things like, you're not supposed to do this in your first paragraph. You're not supposed to do this at the end of the introduction. This should be in the middle. So they expect to see this kind of sequencing move, if you like, okay? And as with any type of rhetorical move, it's evolved for a purpose, and it's evolved because it is functional and it is helpful for the reader. So you may feel like you want to go your own way a little bit, which you can, certainly can in many instances. But you may find yourself reined in a bit when it comes to the reviewing process, depending on who's reviewing your papers generally, okay? In my experience, you can kind of tell where the reviewer is from. If it's an American reviewer, they like to see these rhetorical moves. So if you're submitting to a journal that publishes a lot of American work, you may feel like you need to conform to this type of structure. It'll help you in the long run. Okay, so let's get started. Forward. There we go. Okay. So let's go back to the research article structure itself. So this series of talks, we're focusing on trying to get published in top journals. And most of them have this research article structure, the IMRD, where it's introduction, method, result, discussion. You'll notice on the left-hand side, we have the literature review and conclusion shaded in gray. Sometimes that's given its own heading, sometimes it's not. It depends on the journal that you're submitting it to. So check the guidelines, make sure that you have all the headings that they're looking for. Sometimes the introduction will just go straight through and you wouldn't have a literature review heading there on that kind of level. So today's talk, it focuses on the introduction, the start. So we begin our article, we start very general, giving the context, as you know. Then we move to specific at the end of the introduction and the end of the literature review. Then we have the main body of the paper itself, the method, the result, discussion. And then we broadening out at the end. So it's kind of this funnel shape, if you like. Think about, that's how your content, your writing should be. You're going general, specific, specific, general. One way to look at the whole paper is to look at the questions on the left of the slide here. You're beginning by answering the question, why? Why do we need your paper? Why do we need your research? Okay, so that's the main question that your introduction should be answering. Why? Why do we need this paper? Why do we need it now at this time? Okay, methods, how are you doing your research? Results, what you found, how you've interpreted. And then the conclusion is the so what? What's the contribution of it? Okay, so today we're looking at the introduction, focusing on answering this question, why? Why do we need your paper? That's what the introduction is doing for you. That's its sole purpose. So it's to provide a rationale for the paper. You're moving from a general introduction of your topic to a particular question, problem, or hypothesis, but always keep in your mind, why do we need this paper? That's what any reader, any editor, any reviewer is going to be asking. The secondary purpose is to attract interest in the topic. Why should somebody read the paper? Okay, so in the first instance, you're selling it to the journal. Why do they need the paper? And in the second instance, you're selling it to their readership, why they should read your paper and not the other papers in the journal. So think about the introduction, it's where you sell your paper, okay? Your paper is your product and you're trying to sell it to someone. At different stages, you're trying to sell it to different people. In the first instance, you're trying to sell it to the journal, the editor, and the reviewers. And then the second instance, you're trying to sell it to the readership. Okay, so if you look at the APA guidelines, most journals follow the APA guidelines. The genre is IMRD. It's not called IMLRD, okay? So this is why some journals don't use this section heading, literature review, okay? It's taken out. The literature review was the topic of the last talk, where we talked about how we reviewed the literature, how we build an argument. So before your literature review, it's your introduction proper, if you like, where you're stating the purpose of the study, the theoretical implications, so you're selling it right from the very start, and giving it definitions of any variables or things that your readership may not be familiar with, okay? And then typically, if you have research questions or hypotheses, which you really should have, if you have a research article, they would come after the literature review part, at the very end of the literature review, okay? So it's very rare that you find a research question put into the introduction at the beginning of the section. It's usually towards the end, just before the method is introduced. In typical guidelines, like any kind of, if you're doing an essay writing, anything like that, usually give about 10% of your word count to the introduction. Okay, so if you're submitting a paper that's 9,000 word limit, you don't want any more than 900 in the introduction, okay? We can do it in 3 to 6 paragraphs. Okay, we'll see why in a moment. If your paper if it's not very controversial, if it's just filling a gap and you're adding to something that's very well established, you're not challenging anybody's work, you're not trying to change direction in what you're doing, you can write an introduction in 3 paragraphs, okay? If you're suggesting something new, if you're criticizing the consensus or you're going against the grain, you're going to need more paragraphs because you need to build up more rationale, more of an argument to justify why they need the paper, okay? Because you're going against the majority of people, so you have to have a stronger argument in order for it to stand up to criticism. So 3 paragraphs if your research is not controversial. If you're primarily doing what we call cumulative knowledge building, so you're adding something to the field that's already there. So perhaps you're just filling a little bit of a gap in terms of the research has been done before, but it's been done in other contexts, or it's been done with small sample sizes. So you're just adding to the literature base. You're going to need 6 paragraphs, 6, 7 paragraphs, if your research is going against the grain, or if it's suggesting something new, okay? Because you need to build up a more substantive argument to justify why you need your paper. But there's no hard and fast rules. Always check in the journal, look at the articles that have been published recently in that journal, see what they include in their introduction, see how they've structured it, see what kind of level headings they have, subsections, things like that. See where they put the research question. Some editors may like it in a different position than others. So always check where you're going to publish. Okay, read a lot of the other articles that are in there, so you can get an idea of the overall structure. What we're going to mainly talk about and focus on today is this very famous model. Most people know it. Most people have come across it. It's been around for quite a long time. It's called the CARS model, creating a research space. Okay, so it's an initialism of those words. It's a very common rhetorical pattern that we find in many academic texts. And because it's been around a long time, lots of people have used it and still use it. It's become quite established, so people recognize it. They may recognize it explicitly or implicitly because they've read it so many times. It has 3 rhetorical moves. So when we're talking about rhetorical moves, it's the function that a section of text, what is the job it's doing for you as the writer, okay? So we're going through 3 stages. It has 3 functions, 3 moves, if you like. Move 1, you're establishing the research territory. Move 2, establishing the niche, the gap or the problem. And move 3, you're moving into this gap, you're filling the gap, you're occupying it, okay? So you see 3 moves, minimum 3 paragraphs really to do each of these. You can try and overlap them in paragraphs, but it can get a little bit messy, particularly when you're trying to write it. The way I like to do it, if you look in the Word documents that you were sent beforehand, there are comments on the right-hand side of those Word documents. Those comments just contain the guidelines for each rhetorical move. So when I write a paragraph, I can look at the comment and see, is this paragraph doing that comment? So you can edit accordingly. So there's 3 comments, 3 paragraphs. You can extend it if you like, have 4 paragraphs, 5, 6 paragraphs. But I like to have those comments there. They keep my writing grounded. They stop me from going off topic. They stop me from waffling on and putting too much into move 1, for example, and then not enough in move 2, or maybe missing out move 2 and going from 1 to 3. So use that as a kind of checklist in your Word document to make sure that what you're actually putting in your introduction in those paragraphs has that functional job. Every sentence should be contributing to one of those moves somehow. Keep it there as a reminder. Okay, so this model, this creating a research space, this CARS model, a lot of people like to put it in this inverted pyramid, this triangle, to designate that at the very top, you're being very broad. You're making a lot of general statements at the beginning. Okay, you're not being very specific. You're just establishing your background for the research. Then you're being more specific. You're narrowing down the field to what it is you're working in. And you're identifying a specific gap, a specific problem, questioning something, counterclaiming something, saying something is unclear, basically establishing a problem. And then move 3, you're fixing that problem, you're solving it, you're moving into this gap, moving into this niche. So a simple way to see it is, the beginning, you're setting up the context for your paper, for your research. Then you're setting up the problem, and then you're giving a solution to the problem, okay? So you don't necessarily have to follow the CARS model exactly, as long as you're doing these 3 steps, as long as you are setting up a broad context, narrowing down to a specific problem area, and then providing some kind of solution to that problem, okay? So let's look at move 1 first. Move 1, it's basically the background to your study. You're giving a little broad overview, introduction to the reader. You're showing that the research that you're doing is important, it's central or interesting, problematic or relevant in some way, okay? This is what we call centrality or focus. So you're identifying the area that you're working within, okay, a particular centrality or focus. That also helps your reader because they could decide there and then at the very beginning, do they want to read on or not? Is it relevant to them? You can introduce and review items of previous research, okay? This is required in a lot of cases, depends on what your paper's focusing on. There's a little caveat at the bottom. If your paper is dealing with a very well-known issue that everybody knows about, it's been established for a long time, you may not need to set up the centrality, the focus of it. You can just jump straight to introducing and reviewing items. Okay, so depends on the area that you're working in, the problem that you're focused on, and where you're publishing this particular paper, the readership for it. They may be familiar with the real world problem already, so you can skip over that. We'll see example later on when I show you one of my introductions. Okay, so within move one, within each of these moves, we have individual rhetorical steps. So you have larger steps and then small steps within them. So the first move, or the first one or two paragraphs in your introduction, it's setting up the context for your research. So you need to be claiming the importance of what it is you're researching, okay? In terms of the actual writing action, what you're doing, what you're putting down on paper, you're describing the research problem, very broad, very general, and giving some brief evidence to support why it's important to study. Okay, so the evidence can come in the form of citations, but more often than not, because you're making a general statement, the evidence can come in the form of a general warrant. Okay, some kind of logical statement that's common sense knowledge. People are going to agree with you with that. So you don't necessarily need to get very specific at the very start. You can give a general warrant to support the problem that you're setting up. Notice we have and or. Okay, so you don't necessarily have to have each of these, but you should have at least one of them. Okay, and there's no particular order to it. As we'll see later, you can change the order of this. You can have a little bit of variation within the paragraph. Step two, you're making topic generalizations. So again, you're still being general. We haven't got to being anywhere near specific yet. The writing action, providing statements about the current state of knowledge, consensus, practice, or description of the phenomena. Okay, so more often than not, you see this explicitly cued in the writing. So there'll be things like most researchers now agree upon. There's been over 10 years of study on, something like that along those lines. Very, very general, just about the topic. Or you could be reviewing items of research, okay? So you can be doing one of these steps or all three of these steps. It depends on what you're trying to do by setting up the context, okay? Step three, reviewing items. You're doing a very brief synthesis here, okay? You're not criticizing the actual individual studies themselves. You're just giving a broad overview just to frame the problem that you're going to introduce in the next move. Okay, so it's not a literature review. It's more of a reflection on the key studies that are related to the research problem that you have, okay? So they may have looked at the research problem, but they didn't do it in detail, or they didn't do it in the same way that you're going to do it, but they're still relevant, okay? So before we look at this, have a look at your handout, the Word document. On the first page, page 1, there's an introduction made up of 3 paragraphs. Look at the sentences 1 to 5, okay, in the first paragraph. That first paragraph, it's move 1. It's from a published article, okay. See if you can work out which steps each of the sentence is doing, okay, and write your answers down. So we have Sentences 1 and 2 are doing the same step. 3 and 4 are doing the same step. Sentence 5 is doing another step. Okay, so think about, can you identify what each of those sentences are doing here? Step 1, step 2, or step 3? Just take a few minutes to read that. See if you can identify them. I'm going to give you the answers in a moment. Okay, so I'm not going to ask you for individual answers. Okay, we'll talk about them. You'll have a chance in the breakout room task to do this and talk to each other. Okay, so if you look at the handout itself, sentence 1 and 2, they are doing step 1, describing the research problem. Okay, sentence 3 and 4, they're doing step 2, making topic generalizations, and sentence 5 in red, it's doing step 3, reviewing items of previous research. Okay, so you see that this paragraph, it's the first paragraph of an introduction. It's a 3-paragraph introduction. It's clearly doing move 1. I know it's doing it because I wrote it. So we go in step 1, step 2, step 3 in sequence. It doesn't have to be in sequence. Okay, it just happens to be in this case. We don't have an explicit statement of centrality or focus. That's because the topic of this paper, which is academic written English, it's a very well-known area, and everybody knows it's very problematic for learners, for students. So we don't need to devote space to setting up that. We can just assume that everybody's going to agree that it's a central problem in its own. In terms of the paragraph itself, the first one is describing the research problem. Okay, so we have a general statement. Notice that we're not being very specific yet. We're just introducing the topic in a very broad way. Then we have more topic generalizations. Okay, again, some technical vocabulary is being introduced here, but nothing difficult yet. And then the last paragraph, a very long one, we have a lot of citations here. Okay, so the fact that we have citations are telling us that it's reviewing items of previous research. Okay, so it's basically setting up the paper as fitting in with this field of research. These are all the other papers that have been done on a similar topic in relationship to academic written English. So you know that this paper is going to fit in somewhere. This is the background, this is the context within which this paper is going to be slotted. Okay, so relatively short paragraph made up of 3 moves or 3 steps. Okay, and all together, the combined, that gives us the rhetorical move 1, which is establishing the research, the background, the context. Okay, in terms of the language itself, we have set phrases or syntactic frames. that a lot of people like to use, okay, particularly useful for us. These can be used in move 1 to set up the centrality or the focus. So if anytime you see a statement like this, chances are it's within move 1. Chances are it's establishing centrality or focus. So things like X has been extensively studied, X has become a major issue, and so on, okay? So next time you're looking at papers, or anytime you want to look at a paper a journal you're gonna publish in, look at the papers there, look at the types of structures they are using in the first paragraph, okay? Particularly if it's in a high level journal, they probably will have done the rhetorical moves correctly, and it'll be a good example for you to see, okay? Good. Okay, we're gonna have our first breakout room task now, okay? We're gonna have 10 minutes for this. I think Pawich is gonna put you in room shortly. In the Word document, the handout, moving on to the second page, so move on to page 2. There's a much longer introduction from a journal article there. So I think it's 5 paragraphs. So this is an introduction made up of 5 paragraphs. I'll explain why it's longer later on. But the paragraphs are not in the correct order, okay? All I want you to do for this breakout room task is to try and identify the 2 paragraphs that are establishing the territory. Which paragraphs are doing move 1 for us? Which of the paragraphs seem more likely to be giving us background information? And then cut and paste those into positions 1 and 2. Okay, so you have 4 paragraphs, A, B, C, or D. Cut and paste 2 of those paragraphs so that they're in paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 position. And if you can do that relatively quickly, see if you can identify the steps, what each sentence is doing in terms of step 1, 2, and 3 of move 1. And you can leave the other paragraphs. We'll come back to those in other breakout. Very good. I went into each of the breakout rooms. I think most of you got the correct answers.
Yes.
I was seeing and listening to. The first paragraph was obvious, really. It was the second one that some groups were discussing and debating. If you are in doubt, you can just look at the actual moves themselves. Okay, or the steps within the move. And you'll see that one of the paragraphs is still staying very general, whereas another one is getting specific. It's moving into a specific way. So let's take a look at the answer. So paragraph 1 was D, and paragraph 2 was C. And if you had time, you could see that we were going step 2, step 1, step 1, step 3. So this one is a different order, but it still contains all 3 of the steps. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you forgot to share the screen, right?
Is it not sharing?
No.
Like it says, it has
Started
screen
Pause.
sharing.
Started screen.
Okay, is it working now?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, we see it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for telling me I'm wrong. Okay, so the answers were paragraph D, paragraph C, step 2, 1, and then 1, 3. We can break it down and look at it in terms of what's actually happening. So it begins, paragraph D is your first paragraph within move 1. You're making very general topic statements there at the beginning. So you have, there's now a growing consensus, blah, blah, blah. So you have these key statements, these keywords that you can pick out. And then it moves to describing the research problem. So it's gone step 2, step 1. So remember, you don't need to keep these in the right order, as long as you got them. And then paragraph C, you're still describing the research problem, but then you move into reviewing items of previous research. So the clue here is the number of citations that are getting thrown at you. All of a sudden, there's an explosion of citations. So you've gone into the reviewing items of previous research step. Okay, so you'll notice here that if you look at the colors, the first paragraph, we started purple, making topic generalizations. then research problem. You stuck with research problem as you moved across the 2 paragraphs. So you're creating unity between them. You're still being a cohesive whole. And then you've reviewed items of previous research. Okay, so slightly different organization to the other one that we looked at, but it still has each of the steps that we need. Okay, now we can move on to move 2. So move 2, it's called establishing the niche, the need for your study. Okay, move 1, everybody can do move 1. It's not very difficult. Move 2 is the one that we really need to focus on. Okay, this is the one that sells your paper. This is the one that will get you, this will make or break your paper, basically, in terms of, is the editor or the reviewer going to accept it or not? So I like to call it the significant problem, okay, rather than just niche or gap. It has to be significant. It has to be filled significantly. There has to be a real need for it, okay? If you look at the word niche itself, the definition is opportunity to sell a product or service. Okay, so you have the opportunity to sell your paper, but you really have to sell the significance of the problem or the gap that you're filling. So what's the main selling points of your paper? What are you fulfilling? Okay, let me minimize this. So are you making a clear and cogent argument that your particular piece of research is important and it possesses value? Okay, if you remember back to the last talk we had on literature reviews, we said that the literature review, it's an argument. It's building up an argument. The introduction is doing the same thing, but on a smaller scale, okay? It has to have some kind of argument within it. Otherwise, it's just expository. It's just telling us factual stuff, okay? So it has to be an argument. In terms of the steps, this is what you really need to focus on in your introduction, okay? So not only do we have 4 steps, you can have one and another, or one or another, okay? You don't need to have all 4 of them, but think of them in terms of how significant is the problem that you're setting up with your introduction, okay? Most people go straight for the gap. Is there a gap? Has it been done before? Okay, that's all right, but it's not enough, okay? If you look at this scale here, something is wrong. If you're counterclaiming, that's a stronger, more significant problem than just missing just a gap, okay? So if you really want to get into those top journals, those high level 95th percentile journals, you need to be doing 1A and 1B, okay? Sometimes there's overlap between them. If you're just doing 1B, it's usually quite difficult to get into the higher journals unless there's something really strong and reliable about your study, such as you have a very large sample size, okay? So your statistics are very significant. You have a high power, statistical power with your study. If you're just doing a gap fill study, that's just interviews or something like that, you need to be contributing more, okay? So it's good if you can tick off 2 or more of these in your introduction. The gap, usually easy for us to identify because that's done at the very beginning when we're just formulating an idea for the research. Claiming something wrong, it's quite difficult, okay, particularly if you're working in an established field that's been around for a long time and there's a lot of research within it. Claiming something is unclear, it's a little bit easier. Okay, we can raise a question about that. You can make an inference, particularly when working in our context in Southeast Asia, because so much of the research, it's Anglophone research, it's Western centric. You can raise questions there in terms of how generalizable is some of these findings to Southeast Asian contexts, for example, okay, or EFL context, because a lot of research focuses on ESL in the West, which is slightly different from EFL. So you can raise a question or make inferences there. And 1D is usually ticked because you're generally going to be adding something, okay? But it's important that you explicitly or implicitly state each of these within your introduction. So you're selling it. these steps are what's selling your paper. These are the steps that you need to put a lot of thought into, okay? Particularly something wrong. If you're saying something's wrong, you have to build up an frames, whatever you like. So one area that has been neglected is X. That's very clearly saying something is missing. It's establishing a gap. Okay, so that's a clear, explicit statement saying that this is a gap and you're inferring you're going to be filling it. However, in all three studies, the methodologies used were flawed. So here you're very clearly stating something's wrong and you're going to probably counterclaim it by suggesting a new methodology. So that's a strong contribution. That's a stronger contribution than just one area has been neglected, okay? If you can suggest a new methodology, that's a significant contribution that you're making. The next one, to date, no studies have no clear answer about the role of X and Y. So here you're saying something's unclear, you're raising a question, making inference about something. That said, little is known about X. Okay, so there's not really a gap because we know something about X. So you're going to be adding something to the research there. And the last one, these findings suggest that X might affect Y. So again, you're making an inference there that something is unclear or something's been assumed wrongly in the literature. Okay, so if you can do more than 2 of these at a time, then your contribution is getting stronger and your paper is more sellable, okay, because you're making more of a contribution. So what you're really looking for is 1A and 1B and 1C and 1D if you can. If you can tick all 4 of those, that's a very solid contribution. That's an easy paper to sell. Okay. Again, look at the document. We're back to page 1 this time. Look at page 1 on the Word document. Look at sentences 6, 7, 8, and 9 in the first paragraph. See if you can identify which move each of those sentences are performing for us. Okay, so looking at sentence 6, 7, 8, 9, can you identify which of these steps it is doing? Just a couple of minutes for that.
Could you go back to the direction?
Yes, of course. Sorry. I should probably warn you that one of these sentences is not really doing a step. It's just a linking sentence to help move between steps. Okay, so let's take a look at the answers. So step 6, straight away, as we're moving into move 2, it's hitting you with something is wrong. Okay, so that's very strong straight away. Something is wrong. So it's beginning to start to sell this paper. Then we need a linking sentence because we're moving to something will be added in sentence 8. And then sentence 9, something is missing. Okay, so you see that this one paragraph, this short paragraph, it has 3 different steps in it. Okay, it's not wasting a lot of space by giving everything to 1A or 1D. It's adding all those steps together. So it's saying something is wrong, something's going to be added, something is missing. Okay, so it's really selling this paper hard. Okay, it has to sell this paper hard because it's trying to get into a top journal. Okay. In terms of the paragraph itself, beginning off, something is wrong. However, such research ignores the fact. So that's a very strong statement, saying something is wrong. Then we have a linking sentence because we need to introduce this term texture. Okay, so it's a technical term we need to introduce. And then we have a definition of texture at the beginning, and then we're going into, it's inferring something's going to be added. So we have all of these studies looking at texture, and now something's going to be added. Okay, and what's interesting here is if you look at the dates on these citations, they're very old. Okay, going back to 1976. So that's telling you that nothing has been done in a very long time on this concept. Okay, so that's why you have to say something is wrong. If nothing is wrong, then there's no need for you to be doing research after 20 years after this topic's finished. Okay, and then you finally finish with something is missing. Okay, so we still don't know why students can't create this texture in longer texts. Okay, so it's a problem that's been around for a long time, but nobody's been addressing it, and people kind of gave up on it, if you like. Okay, it became a dead topic. So you're picking up on this dead topic. And we'll see, if you look at the last paragraph, when we come to that in a moment, that's what you're picking up, that's what you're selling. You're saying that this was a dead topic for 20 years. I'm bringing it back to life because I have this new perspective on it. Okay. So linguistic markers of move 2, when you're pointing out this significant problem or significant gap, you want to do it in a nice way, okay? Because you need to think about the people who are going to review your paper. If you're submitting to a Q1, Q2 journal, they can pretty much get any reviewer they want, okay? So they will ask people that you are referencing in your paper. So if you've criticized somebody's work and you've given a citation for their work saying, this work is rubbish, I'm going to do better, they will ask that person to review your paper. And you can imagine yourself, if you read somebody saying your work is rubbish, you're not going to be very nice to that person when you review their work. You're going to be very, very harsh. You're going to be very detailed. Okay. So if you have to criticize somebody's work, do it in a nice way. So you don't want to adopt a negative stance. Okay. Within the context of prior research. So you need to use these more neutral, contrastive statements. Okay. Such as these here. Research into A can be useful, but to counterbalance X, it is important to consider B. So very neutral there in what you're saying. These studies have emphasized A as opposed to B. While prior studies have examined A, it may be preferable to contemplate the impact of B. Study A has been exhaustive, but changing circumstances related to X support the need for examining or revisiting B. Okay, so all very nice, very polite sentences. Okay, so you're expressing a new perspective without diminishing the validity of other people's research. Okay, so you have to be very careful there. Always put yourself in that position. How would you feel if somebody was criticizing your work, not being very kind or fair to you? Okay, so we have another breakout room task. now, another 10 minutes. You should be a little bit quicker this time. Go back to the introduction you have on page 2. Try to identify the paragraphs that perform the function of rhetorical move 2 and put them in the positions of paragraph 3 and paragraph 4. Okay, and try to identify, you should have a little bit more time this time because it's only 2 paragraphs you need to move around. See if you can identify the steps 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D that compose move 2. Okay. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Okay, so let's wait a few seconds for everybody's. Move back. I think so. Okay, so let's look at the answers first, and then I'll talk about the paragraphs in detail. So paragraph 3 was B, paragraph 4 was A. You probably realized or noticed that these 2 paragraphs, they're a lot more complex than the ones on page 1. Okay, let's look at each of the paragraphs first, and then I'll explain why they have so many elements within them. So in terms of paragraph B, this is the start of move 2, okay? And it starts very strong again, just like the one on page 1. It starts by saying something is wrong, okay? It starts by saying it's difficult to give feedback on writing processes because you can't really observe what's going on inside a student's mind, okay? We can see what they're writing on paper, but if they're just sitting there and they're planning in their head or they're revising in their head, we're not really seeing that. We don't know what's going on. And particularly with everything that's switched to COVID online writing classes, we have no idea what these students are doing, okay? So it's setting up a problem. I think something is wrong. When you have these online writing classes, we can't give them feedback on what they're writing. Okay, we can only give them feedback on the product, and we don't even know if they're writing the product. Maybe something else, somebody else is writing for them. So we have this establishing a problem, what's wrong, step 1A, on the very first sentence of move 2. Then it has to introduce this research tool, okay, this software. So there's quite a long definition of it here, telling us how it's useful, okay, what it's been used for. So that's necessary because this study is setting up, it's trying to sell this tool as a feedback tool in writing classes, but that's a hard sell, okay. I had a lot of trouble selling this paper to a lot of journals, okay, because if you think about composition studies, they're very set in their ways, they're very traditional, they like to have their feedback. They like to have their written corrective feedback. They like to have these loops of plan, draft, revise, and they don't like anybody suggesting something that doesn't go with that narrative, okay? So that's why this introduction is very complicated, because it's trying to sell something that people don't want, basically. So we're starting saying something is wrong, then you're building up your solution, if you like, a little bit at a time, saying something is going to be added with regard to these papers. Continuing on, something will be added. Okay, so just like we had in the other paragraph on page 1, you see here that the 2 paragraphs are split. Okay, we have 1A, then 1D. When we start the new paragraph, we're continuing with 1D. Okay, so you're staying with the same step, just so you can create that cohesion between the papers. And then you're saying something's unclear, okay? So there's no real gap because this is brand new research, okay? So you can't really say there's a gap if nobody's done it before. So it's only can have 1A, 1C, 1D, okay? Anybody who works in writing research knows that feedback is a massive research area. There's not a lot of gaps in terms of written corrective feedback. So I'm trying to move into a different paradigm altogether, if you like, looking at the process and feedback on process instead of feedback on products. So that's why this introduction is so long. Okay, it's much longer than the example on page 1 because you're trying to sell something that people don't want, people are not familiar with. So you're trying to get your foot in the door. So you have to build up a more comprehensive argument, okay, with this move. So you see move 2 here is quite complex. It's very long. It's spread across 2 paragraphs, okay, and I haven't even been able to include the rest of this paragraph because it's so long. So think about what your study is doing, okay? If you're trying to suggest something brand new that people haven't heard of, people won't like because you're not following the crowd, so to speak, then move 2 is going to be very complex because move 2 is where you're establishing the problem, establishing your argument, okay? So it's the most difficult part to write. We'll move on to move 3 now. So you've set up your problem, your significant problem, your significant gap. Now you're going to be moving into this gap or solving this problem. This is where, what are you contributing and how? Okay, so in a lot of papers that I review, this move is pretty much missing in a lot of papers. Okay, people don't seem to do it. They talk about their method, they talk about their findings, but that's not really doing move 3 for you. Okay, you're not really telling me what you're contributing. So that's not really much of a move 3. It's not telling me your response. You need to tell the reader, the reviewer, what your contribution is in contrast to prior research. So you're answering this so what question, okay? What have you done? How have you done it? How have you done it? It's very easy. You just describe your method. What have you done is the difficult thing, okay? Everything else in this move is secondary to these 2 things. You don't even need the other things, okay? You don't really need to talk about findings or the organization of the structure. You've got to have these 2 elements first. So let's take a look at them. Again, we have a number of steps. Only 1A or 1B we have to have, okay? Step 2 and step 3, don't worry about those. They're not really doing a lot to sell your paper, okay? People can just skip to the findings section if they want to look at it, or you'll have some findings in your abstract, okay? And indicate article structure. Everybody knows how an article is structured, so you don't really need to tell them that. Next, you're going to talk about your methods, then you're going to have results, then you'll have discussion, then you'll have conclusion. If you're submitting an IMRD paper, everybody knows how that's organized. Don't waste any space talking about that, okay? So let's look at 1A and 1B. 1A is the most important one, announce purpose, okay? The writing action here, you're answering the so what. So we have statements like, this paper argues, this paper clarifies, this paper further advances. So statements like that, they are explicitly stating what your contribution is. Okay, you're being very clear. You're not trying to hide anything. Okay, you're not burying the reader by throwing findings at them. You're telling them, this is what we did. This is what we contributed. So be very explicit. A lot of the times, I know when I'm reviewing a paper, I'll jump to the end of the introduction because I know that's where I should find the contribution. That's where I'll find the actual impact of this paper. What has this paper done? Okay, what have they contributed? I'm not interested in the results just yet. I want to know what they think they've contributed to the field. And then 1B, announce research. Very easy to write this one. Doesn't take a lot of thought. Okay, we have statements like, this paper describes, this paper examines, explores, uses. So it's basically a very, very quick summary of your method or your framework. Okay, easy, anyone can do that. It's this 1A that we have to focus on. Okay, step 2 and 3, 3, don't need that. Don't waste your time. Step 2, you can do that if you have very good findings. Okay. Sometimes they'll tell you to put that in if an editor wants to see it, but that's very easy to write. 1A is the one we need to focus on. So look at the first page again on your handout, page 1. Look at the final paragraph of that introduction. So you're looking at sentences 10 to 15 on page 1. Which step of move 3, A, B, C, or D, is each sentence performing? Okay, you can use the comment in the document to help you. The comment outlines each of the steps. So remember, the important steps you're looking for are step 1A and 1B. C or D are optional. So see if you can identify what steps these sentences are doing in this third paragraph on page 1. It'll take a couple of minutes for that.
Neil, I have some questions.
Yes.
Yeah, I when I take a look at your sentence, sentence 11, right? You, I see your contribution and your research announcement, right? And I think about when I read some business research in quite a high level, I found that researchers put research applications at the very ends, and sometimes they put maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs trying to sell their contributions to those reviewers. So that could be another one different from Swale's model, right?
Yes, yes. Generally speaking, you have your contribution at the end of the conclusion. The way I like to do it is I'll have maybe 3 paragraphs in the conclusion and 1 contribution in each paragraph. Yeah, and then you'd also you'd state it again at the end of the introduction.
Yeah, and I like your way that you put artistic features in your 11 sentence 11, right? Something to sell your work in terms of contribution, but actually you are announcing your research, right?
Yes, there's a mixture. I move between two in that sentence. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love they're both combined. I think we can take a look at these now, and I can talk about it in more detail. Okay, so you'll see that this whole paragraph, it's only doing 1B and 1A. So it's moving between 1B, 1A constantly. Yeah. So we have announced research, we have the key terms, use, to explore. And then as Sanay said in sentence 11, we have a purpose and announced research at the same clause. So one is leading into another. So study contributes by examining. And we have more announced research it looks at. Then another purpose seeks to advance. And then we have announced research again. Okay, so we have 2 instances of announced purpose and 5 announce research. There's no step 2, there's no step 3. Okay. So think about how you can maximize the end of your introduction to get this purpose across, to sell the paper. Okay. Particularly if you don't have a very large data set, you're not going to have substantial findings, okay? Because most of your paper, if you're working in a qualitative framework, a lot of your discussion will be interpretation, which technically is difficult to frame as a finding as such, okay? Because it's your interpretation, it's an argument that you build up. So you need to reframe that as purpose. What are you contributing? Okay, what are you advancing? That kind of thing. If we look at the paragraph itself, again, we're starting with the most important step. Okay, I always like to start the paragraphs with the most important step of each move. Okay, in move 2, the most important step is saying something is wrong. So start the paragraph with that. In move 3, the most important step, it's announce research or announce purpose. So start with one of those. Here we've now announced research, then announce purpose. Okay. No, most of the time I announce the purpose, but I've had to introduce this texture term again because it's a very awkward term for people to get to grips. So then we have the study contributes to, that's the key term there, by examining how. So switching into announce research. Then more specific, it looks at in terms of. Then you have another purpose, signaled by secondly. So firstly, secondly, seeks to advance. Okay, so it's bringing two different disciplines together. And then announce research again by exploring. And then at the end, we kind of have a combination at the end, purpose and research. Thirdly, this is one of the first studies, if not the first, to explore. Okay, so that's quite a strong selling point if you're the first study to do something and nobody else has done it. Okay, so other studies have done it, but not across multiple sessions in a naturalized setting, meaning not observing someone, they're just writing at home on their own time. Okay, there's no experimental setting going on. Okay. So last breakout room task of today. This time we are looking at page 3 of the Word document. This is from a different article, so it's a new introduction for you. Okay. This article, much shorter introduction, only 3 paragraphs, I think it was. I've given you 2 paragraphs, A and B. A is establishing the niche, the problem, the gap. Paragraph B, it's occupying or moving into that gap. So in your breakout room, try to identify which steps of move 2 and move 3 each of the sentences is performing. Okay, I haven't given you move 1 because everybody can write move 1. That's simple. It's move 2 and move 3 that we need to focus on. Okay, so in your rooms, look at paragraph A, look at paragraph B, identify the steps of each of the sentences, move 2, move 3. Okay, this paper, it's in a very high level journal, so expect it to be doing the most important steps within these paragraphs. Okay, sharing. Okay, so you had move 2 and move 3. Because this paper was being sold to a very high impact journal, move 3 needed to be filled with purpose, basically. Okay, so it starts with announcing the research, sentence 1 and 2. How is it making a contribution? What is it looking at? What is it exploring? And then sentence 3 and 4 and 5, they were all doing step 1A for us, announcing the purpose. What is it contributing? Okay. So this paper, when I submitted it, it had 3 reviewers. Then I had another 3 reviewers, so it had 6 reviewers altogether, and they all kept hounding me. What is your purpose? What is your purpose? What is your purpose? So you have to be very, very explicit with it. Okay, so not only is it in your introduction, it's also in the conclusion. And if you look at that paragraph, move 3 paragraph on the last page of the handout, you see that it's framed explicitly. So we have a methodological contribution, theoretical contribution, and an empirical contribution. Okay, 2 of the sentences start off with the words methodologically, theoretically. So it's been very explicit in saying what the contribution is, not only overall in general, but also within those individual strands. Okay, so try to pick those out of your paper. Think about, okay, you're filling a gap with your findings. That's your empirical contribution. How else are you solving this problem? Are you solving it with a methodological contribution? Are you solving the problem by adding some kind of theoretical contribution? Are you solving the problem by suggesting some kind of pedagogical contribution? Okay, so be specific with what you're actually giving back to the field. So think of it in terms of the 4 main strands. You have the empirical findings, your results, which are filling the gap. You have your methodological contribution. So maybe you're suggesting a new methodology, you're suggesting a change or an edit to an existing methodology. Maybe you're combining methodologies in a unique way that nobody's done before. Think of it in terms of the theory. How are you adding to the theory? Are you showing things are connected where people didn't think they were connected before? Are you adding a new theoretical strand, a new construct, a new concept, something like that? And particularly in our field, if you're working in language teaching, what is the pedagogical contribution? How is this going to help future teachers? How can it be applied into teaching? What is your findings suggest? Is there anything we can take away and use in the classrooms or used to improve teaching? Okay, so let's have a brief summary, and then we'll have some time for some questions. So we've gone through the CARS model today. You don't need to remember all the steps. You don't need to memorize them. Copy and paste those comments into your Word document like I have done in the handout. Okay, I do the same thing when I'm writing an abstract, and I do the same thing when I'm writing the conclusion. I'll have comments with specific rhetorical moves or functions that my paragraphs need to be doing. Okay, that will keep you focused. It'll keep you on topic. You know, when you start writing or typing, you can go off topic very quickly. You can end up writing 800 words, only 50 words are good. Okay, so use those comments to keep you focused, keep you on topic. We've moved from context to the problem to the solution. That's the easiest way to see your introduction. In terms of the context, establishing a territory, the first move, the beginning of your introduction, the first paragraph, show your research area is important, relevant, central. Okay, so it's your research area. You don't need to be very broad. Bring it down, narrow it to what you're actually working within. Okay, make valid generalizations about the current state of knowledge, and you can review items of previous research. Okay, this is more of a scoping exercise, just to acknowledge that you know ABC has been done already. It helps to frame your paper as well. If you can give some key references, key studies at the beginning, other people will then be able to know the framework or the area that you're working in, because you're already giving them examples of the studies. Move 2, again, this is the height of the selling of your paper. What is wrong? Step 1A, that's the strongest claim you can be making, the strongest significant problem. What is missing or gap? That's usually the minimum you have to have. And then try to add in the other ones. What is unclear? what can be developed or added to, okay? So try to put in as many of those steps as you can into the middle of your introduction, into the move to section. And then move 3 at the end, your response to the problem. How are you solving this problem? How are you moving into this gap? How are you filling your gap? And the most important ones here are step 1A and step 1B. Okay, 1A, what are you contributing in terms of empirical findings, methodology, theory, pedagogy, policy making, anything that's making a change in the real world, okay? And step 1B, how are you making this contribution? What did you do in very short, brief, active sentences? Step 2 and 3 are optional. We don't really need those, okay? So you can think about leaving them out if you wanted to. Okay, so that's the end of the talk. Obviously, I drew upon Swales and Feek, which is the bottom reference here, if you want to look at their textbook. In my opinion, a better textbook is the one by Wallace and Ray, Critical Reading and Writing for postgraduates, okay? Alison was my PhD supervisor. That's a very, very good book. It's very technical, okay? You can look her up if you want to on Google Scholar. You can see how much she's published. She knows exactly what she's doing, okay? So if you want to improve your writing, your critical writing, particularly in terms of building arguments, in terms of claims and warrants that you're making, have a look at that book, okay? It's a very, very good book.